The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Let us pray. God of bodies, if it is true that the earth is yours and all within it, then yours are the rocks and grasses on every side of every border, and more, yours are the faces of every person, border dwellers, border crossers, border guards, border deniers, border defenders, borderless, border full, border endangered, and border dreamers. What we ask is simple, but it will take many lifetimes. Let us make borders serve us, not us them. And again, let us be people who make justice, stretch across borders, because the earth is yours and everything in it. It is round and everything turns on itself. May we turn to each other as we turn to you. Amen.
Amen.
And once again, welcome everybody. Thank you for turning in. Again, please mute yourself as you come on so we can make sure that we get a chance to hear everything that's going to be shared with us this evening. We are recording this once again, so if you would prefer for your image not to be shared elsewhere, please go ahead and stop video, but stay with us in spirit. I want to share a little bit about our guest this evening for Transformation Academy. We are joined by Troy Elder. Troy is the Diocesan Border Missioner. He's an attorney, community and faith-based activist, and former law professor with nearly 25 years of experience representing refugees and immigrants. He speaks Spanish, French, and Haitian Creole. Troy has worked on various aspects of immigrant advocacy at numerous organizations throughout the United States and abroad. He spent a decade teaching immigration law, poverty law, international human rights, and ethics at the US and foreign law schools, most recently at Yale. He also studied liberation theology and colonization as a Henri Nouwen Scholar at Yale Divinity School, receiving a master's degree in religious ethics in 2013. He will be our keynote this evening, and we're grateful, Troy, to you for joining us. I forgot to mention my name. I'm Jason Evans. I am the canon for mission here in the diocese. Just got started, so thank you for allowing me to host this evening. But once again, Troy, thank you for leading us this evening. I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and turn this over to you, friend.
Thanks, Jason, and congratulations on your new responsibilities and prayers rising. Very, very thrilled to have you in that role. And thanks to everybody who's tuned in tonight. I'm in the space, I think, of less than an hour, going to try to cover, well, more topics than I thought I was going to be covering a month ago when we started planning this session. Immigration, even just beyond the border, but immigration is kind of an unwieldy beast, as I'm sure many of you know, and it has changed, frankly, daily, up into including today, when I heard about a really important court decision that I'll share with you later that affects the southwest border. So it is far from a polished project, I guess, or pat or neat, tidy presentation. It is going to be, what I'd like it to be is as interactive as possible, and I'm happy to the extent possible, follow the chat for questions if folks have them, or maybe pause after each chunk. But what I'd like to do is spend a fair amount of time talking about the southwest border. As was mentioned, I'm the relatively new border missioner for the Episcopal Diocese of San Diego. I was starting to talk in court speak, thinking of the Southern District of California, which is where one of the big decisions came out. But and took this position on about 2 months ago. And of course, as anybody who's been paying at least a modicum of attention to the news knows, we've had several and significant new crises, and I'll call them that. No need to soft pedal it. in terms of migration, forced migration, and otherwise in the last couple of months. So certainly there is no lack of things to talk about. But what I thought I would do tonight, given that this is my first presentation on this topic to this audience, and it'll be supplemented by occasional columns or updates in the diocesan news channels, is to give some numbers to give folks a sense of really the magnitude of the human phenomenon that is happening just a few miles to our south. And then I want to pivot and show some faces and just give an example of what one parish in our diocese has been doing for about a year and a half, St. Margaret's Episcopal in Palm Desert, which just fortuitously I'd been involved in, up to and including when I took over this, took on these responsibilities, just to show that it's more than just numbers and family units, and as you see on the page here, statistics and demographics. And then I thought I would, in the final few minutes, pivot and talk about Afghanistan, because it's hard to talk about refugee flows and not talk about this latest phenomenon, crisis, whatever you want to call it. Frankly, in 20 years of doing this type of work, I think the Afghan refugee situation is unprecedented in many ways. And I think it makes particular claims on us as Christians and other people of faith and people of conscience. So if folks are okay with that MO, and I will try to keep an eye on the chat if there are questions, I thought I would just jump into what you see here on the screen, I hope. And that is, these are statistics from our government, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, which is one of the three branches of the Department of Homeland Security that have to do with immigration and citizenship, roughly. The other being ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which has to do with mostly operations in the interior, including immigration detention. And the third being U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which, among other things, grants visas and adjudicates asylum claims in certain cases. So I think it is probably common knowledge, again, just how explosive the growth has been in what are termed here encounters at the southwest land border. So in this graph, I'll just kind of walk us through it a little bit. You'll see so far in this fiscal year, which ends in October, the blue line compared to where we were in prior years is above 200,000. And this is on the news every night, right? I want to unpack a little bit what this means. But 200,000 encounters at the southwest border in August and September of this year. It looks like August, 208,000 encounters. Well, what does that mean? That means folks who have been either intercepted or apprehended by the Border Patrol or Customs and Border Protection and immediately returned under a COVID era policy called Title 42, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. People who have approached a port of entry and asked for example, asylum, and kind of a miscellaneous category of folks. It does not mean that there are now 200,000 new immigrants, if you will, or new migrants in the United States. It also is a bit of a double count because under this Title 42 expulsion policy, immigrants or presumed migrants are routinely turned back without any paperwork being done. And so there's a lot of what some like to call recidivism, a lot of repeat crossers of all nationalities, mostly Mexican. And so, estimates vary, but these are not 200,000 unique encounters. Still, we are orders of magnitude above what we saw in prior years. Because those as well included various types of of encounters, including sort of this double counting for somebody who tries to come across 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7 times. I thought it would be interesting a little bit to talk about, particularly in light of what our diocese was involved in the earlier part of this year with respect to unaccompanied minors and the pastoral care that was offered at the San Diego Convention Center, to parse a little bit the breakdown, parse a little bit the numbers and review the breakdown here of the different types of folks that are being encountered, right? So again, looking at the blue bar graph, which is this year, a big chunk are single adults. Then you have family units that include generally FMUA, include some children. Then you have UCs, unaccompanied children or single minors, and that would be the category of kids. We saw a lot of teenage girls from what are called the Northern Triangle countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, who were received at the San Diego Convention Center. And AM, I actually forget exactly what that is, but it's pretty marginal. So what you see is a major swell or surge at our southern border, at our southwestern border. And I want to pivot now a little bit to what that means in terms of how folks are being, I hate to use the word processed, but seen in the immigration courts. And I just need to pull this back up. And in detention centers. So this is a great website, by the way. I dropped this into the chat. TRAC is a service that is administered by Syracuse University and has amazing stats and pretty up to date on what's going on with various aspects of immigration law and procedure. So you can see that so over 250,000 new court cases have been recorded so far in this fiscal year, adding to a already existing backlog, which you now see totals down at the bottom of the page, 1.4 million cases over 1.4 million cases nationwide in the backlog. I thought it was sort of interesting as well. A lot of times there's rhetoric around as I'm sure many of you are aware, around the alleged sort of criminal nature of many immigrants, et cetera, et cetera. It was a big issue for some in the last, in 2 presidential elections ago. But only 2% of folks in these new cases are being actively deported based on some sort of criminal activity. And oftentimes, if you dig down into these statistics, it's usually, it can be something as minor as a traffic ticket or another type of moving violation or traffic citation for which the person has already done their time, if you will, paid the debt to society. So I share these statistics to give you a sense of the magnitude of the burden that is increasingly being placed on a system of adjudication of immigration applications, which has been broken for many, many years and continues to be broken. We'll come to that in a few minutes about what that means and how to sort of get out of this mess. I did want to go to a little bit of local data here in California, just to give you a sense of, this is LA. Let me go to San Diego. We have immigration courts here in San Diego and in El Centro in Imperial County. Those are the 2 immigration courts in our diocese. So you can see how the backlog breaks down in the San Diego Immigration Court, which had its own kind of wrinkle the last couple of years due to a program called the Migrant Protection Protocols, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. So you can see the number of completed cases over the number of years, and then also the average days, how long it was taking. Oops, sorry, for some reason it pushed me into New York there. How did that happen? Yeah, I don't know why it went. I don't know why it took me to New York. Well, if you click on the link that I put in the chat, if you're so inclined, playing with this is not that hard. You'll be able to find the average number of days, as well as the outcome of these cases. What's happening with all these cases? Removals are what we hear. I think folks can see my cursor, are what we colloquially would call deportations. And so let's say we're back here at Los Angeles. Let me go to San Diego. Okay. The number of cases by the outcome. And a big chunk of them are actually deportations. They end in orders of removal, which are or are not executed depending on the resources of immigration and customs enforcement. So let me go back to the main quick facts here. This is actually what I was trying to get to a few seconds ago. So the number of immigrants ordered deported by immigration judges this year, and that's 37,000. Mexico is the top nationality ordered deported, perhaps not a big surprise, particularly in this part of the country. And this, I think, is particularly instructive and indicative of the extent of the procedural problem. Right here, only 20.6% of immigrants, including unaccompanied children, had an attorney to assist them in immigration court cases when a removal order was issued. So unlike in a criminal case, and I hesitate to even draw comparisons between criminal and immigration cases because they're so different, but inevitably folks want to know, well, how come they're an immigrant, is not entitled to a free lawyer in immigration court? Well, strictly speaking, immigration is a civil matter akin to a traffic ticket or complying with your taxes, really theoretically on the level of what constitutes civil versus criminal law. And in this country, one is not entitled to a lawyer paid for by the government to represent him or herself in deportation proceedings, except in very limited circumstances that I won't detain us here with. So the vast majority of immigrants end up representing themselves. You have the right to have an attorney, right? But you do not have the right to have that attorney paid for by the government, by the US government. There's some small changes on that front at the local and sometimes state level, but certainly not at the federal level of trying to, in effect, enshrine a public defender system for immigrants. All right, I want to now pivot to, and I'm going to again take a look at the chat just to see if there's anything here, and I don't see anything. Oh, I do see a chat. Okay.
We don't have any questions quite yet.
Oh, great.
Troy, but
Okay,
we are
so
making sure the links are being shared with everybody.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, good. I will then not really worry about that until maybe somebody alerts me to the fact that there's a chat, because I'm trying to toggle between a couple of different things here. So I was sharing this information about immigration court, but the other side of or another aspect to what's happening when folks cross US borders, either at a port of entry, quote unquote, legally, or in between ports of entry, colloquially, illegally, is immigration detention, which in this country is largely a private for-profit system of mostly private prisons run by corporations, answerable to shareholders, who are guaranteed a certain number of beds under contracts with the United States government. This page shows where we are as of just a couple of days ago, actually, with the number of immigrants in detention. You'll see, compared to May of 19, and I'll talk about the distinction between ICE and CBP in a second, where under the prior administration, we were at a high of pushing 40,000 immigrants detained on any given day throughout the country, to a really kind of a low point several months ago, and then we've started to see in the 6 months or 8 months now since the Biden administration has been in power, a resumption of really kind of close to or getting back up to some of the rates that were certainly under the Obama administration and then also under the Trump administration. Customs and Border Patrol will be the arresting agency, as might be sort of obvious, at the border. They generally hold folks for 72 hours and really don't have the capacity to do much more, although there have been circumstances in the last couple of years where Customs and Border Patrol, Customs and Border Protection and its subsidiary, the Border Patrol itself, have detained families, children, and others for periods of 5 to 7 days, and sometimes even longer. But the big detainer, the big immigration enforcement agency, of course, is ICE, which has jurisdiction over basically 100 miles within the United States, within a 100-mile the 100 miles from the US border. The interior is the jurisdiction of ICE. Sorry, I'm a little tongue-tied on that one. Again, here, so that's where we are as of a few days ago. Back up to kind of half of where we were under the prior administration. I thought I would share a little bit. Let's see, I wanted to show, sorry. I wanted to show local data. So the detention facilities that are of interest really here in our neck of the woods are two. Down here, about 10 down where my cursor is, there is the Otay Mesa Detention Center, which is a privately run facility by a group called Core Civic that has, according to this, 750 beds, or a guaranteed minimum of 750 beds on a particular day, though we've seen it house more than that during peak periods. It's located not far from the Otay Mesa port of entry, down by the border. And the second in our diocese is the Imperial Regional Detention Facility in Calexico. And you'll see that this has a guaranteed bed capacity of 640. I can tell you that the capacity of the facility is more around 720. And right now, as of a few days ago, you can see that this one's about half that capacity, and Otay Mesa is a little over half of its guaranteed minimum. So those are the two big detention centers, frankly, the only real detention centers of interest in our diocese. But they are part of a larger family, as you can see, of detention facilities around the country that are owned by basically a handful of private for-profit prison companies who are guaranteed certain amounts of beds per day, as you can see from this. So I just thought this would be interesting to give folks a sense of really the scope and the geography of immigrant detention at this point. So I commend this track, which again, I've put into the chat. It's kind of interesting and it's pretty user-friendly to, if you're curious about sort of on a given day, how many people are being held, what's going on in the court system, and a number of other things too, if you want to explore, getting into a little off topic here, but getting into asylum cases, the numbers of adjudications, the numbers of folks and the percentages per country, where people are coming from, and things like that. Roy,
we do have a question for you.
Sure.
And it's regarding the private for-profit prison. What incentive do they have for reducing detainees if more detainees means more profit?
That's a great question. There are not a lot of great incentives for these private companies, and why this is one of the reasons why there's a big move to get them shut down. There's not a lot of incentive for them either to reduce certainly their business model, right? Reduce their profit and their margins, nor is there incentive for them to guarantee quality care, whether it's medical care, food, what have you. when the profit motive is there, sadly, and you've got kind of literally a captive audience and a third party payer, i.e. the US government, and not a lot of avenues for folks to complain because they're detained. And once they're out, if they do get out, they're oftentimes with families that are kind of on the lowest socioeconomic rung of our ladder. No, there's a lot of abuse in the private for-profit immigration detention system. California, in certain aspects, eliminated private prisons in the criminal justice system, and the U.S. government was on its way to do so at the federal criminal level. And now this, in some respects, these 3 or 4 companies, or the 3 or 4 big ones, are holdouts. So they've got powerful lobbyists in Washington. It is in particular in parts of the country where there's not a lot of economic opportunity, and that includes certain parts of California. Sorry, don't look at this is the Afghan stuff is next. There is a strong incentive to create local jobs that, prison guards and others. And it is, yeah, it's a problem. It's a problem.
We had another question. Can I
Sure.
pose that to you now?
Please.
And you can either address it at the moment or later on.
Yeah.
As you may have seen, the New York Times had an article today about the thousands of migrants, mostly Haitian, packed under a bridge near Del Rio.
Yeah.
And the conditions that were faced there. Can you talk about the conditions of those who are waiting in Mexico? And are we seeing a surge of Haitian migrants in our area at this point?
Yeah. Great question, thank you. And actually great segue into the next part of what I wanted to talk about. So I'm still sharing my screen, and you'll see this is actually to answer your question, kind of talking about the conditions. This is a shelter in Mexicali, right over the border from Calexico, about 2 hours east of San Diego. It is called La Cobina. It is basically a 2-story, what we might call motel, that, and this is the reference I made earlier to St. Margaret's Episcopal Palm Desert, folks from that parish and others, St. Paul's Cathedral, St. Paul's Palm Springs, and various others, interfaith partners, have been supporting in one way or another over the last year and a half, even during COVID. And I haven't really got to the point talking about exactly how people are getting across or what's happening, like the Haitians under the bridge. And I will come to Haitians in a minute. But I think this might be a great place for me to just play this short video. It's about 4 minutes. The woman whose profile is using a pseudonym actually is someone we helped get across with her little daughter in June. And I think this is kind of gives you a sense of what's going on in very close to our diocese.
Even in her worst nightmares, Erica Hernandez couldn't have imagined her life would turn out like this.
I feel very lonely. I miss my daughters. I miss my home, my husband.
For the past year and a half, Erica has been living in a shelter on the Mexican side of the border with her youngest daughter. Her 2 older girls are more than 250 miles away with her grandmother in Arizona. She has no idea where her husband is, and at this point doesn't even know if he's alive. Born in Mexico, she was smuggled into the US illegally as a child. She grew up in Phoenix, where she started a family, until her husband, who was also undocumented, was deported back to Mexico. Erica, who asked us not to use her real name, made the difficult decision to follow him.
I said, I have to be with the father of my daughters. I don't want him to be without him.
For a few years, life in Mexico was looking up. They bought a ranch and had a 3rd daughter, Ariadna. Then, one night, she got a panicked call from her husband saying he'd been kidnapped by the local cartel.
He said, they're going to hurt you. I know they are going to hurt you because I don't have no money.
She immediately sent her 2 oldest daughters, both US citizens, back to Arizona to live with her mother. Then left everything behind and headed north with her baby to Mexicali, a sweltering town on the Mexican side of the border with shelters for deported migrants.
Ay, bebé.
Altagracia Tomayo Madueño runs the Cobina shelter. Most of her residents, she said, are fleeing violence. There are 30 families here, all desperately trying to find a way to cross into the U.S. The children, she says, suffer the most. Erica has been sharing this room with another family. Ariadna, now 2 years old, has known little else outside these pink walls. And what do you tell her about this place?
I'm pretty sure she thinks that this is a home, that all the people that are here are her family. And they are.
Erica is now seeking asylum in the U.S. But for others here, that may not be an option. Luis came here from Honduras with his wife and 2 small children. The trek to the border took 2 years, mostly by bus, and when the money ran out, by foot. He says he may cross illegally if he can't get asylum. He came here, he said, to escape the kidnapping in his own country, where criminal gangs routinely demand extortion money. His dream is to be able to provide the basics for his family. In Honduras, he said, he was lucky to make $12 a day. In America, he could make that in 1 hour. I asked him if he's afraid of getting caught as he crosses with his children. Yes, he tells me, but that's the only way I can have a life and maybe even a little house someday. But entering the U.S. illegally can be extremely dangerous. 76 migrants died trying to cross the U.S.-Mexico border during the first 3 months of 2021. In March, an SUV packed with 25 undocumented immigrants crashed into a big rig near the town of Holtville on the U.S. side of the border. 13 people were killed. Erica is determined to cross legally. The hardest part, she said, is knowing that her daughters are growing up without her.
We are good people. We just want to feel safe and free.
Living life in limbo while holding on to the hope that one day soon she'll be holding all her children.
All right, I'll stop sharing for the moment. So I shared that, as I said at the beginning, largely to give you a sense of sort of what the shelter that some of us have been working at looks like. I would tell you that, and we can talk about folks under bridges and camped out as well. That's relatively luxurious housing, if you want to call it that. The converted motel has, I think, 20 rooms. And right now, or as of about 2 weeks ago, there were 140 people. You didn't see them back in June when that story was done, largely because I think it was during the day and some of the men were out working and the kids were in school, the school being 2 of the motel rooms on the upper floor. But folks who have come from both Central America and other parts more far flung are routinely spending 6, 12, 18 months on the Mexican side of the border. I'll quickly mention to sort of answer the Haitian piece. Haitians, yes, we have a large population of Haitians both in Tijuana and a lesser proportion in in Mexicali. I've seen estimates of between 3,000 and 5,000 that are in Tijuana. And that actually started under the Obama administration when a lot of Haitians who had fled their country after the 2010 earthquake, of course, echoes of which we saw less than a month ago with a less serious but also horrific earthquake in Haiti, had gone to Brazil and Chile to work, and to, in Brazil at least, to work on the Olympic Stadium and the Olympic Park, as well as the World Cup soccer stadium. And once those projects were finished, they were sort of shuffled out of the country and started making their way north in 2015, 2016. And we started seeing the Haitian population amass, if you will, in Tijuana and other parts along the border, but particularly in Tijuana, even before the Trump administration. So yes, we have a significant Haitian population in and around San Isidro, and certainly on the Mexican side of the border. There's actually a small community called Little Haiti. It's a little Haiti community like they have in Miami, in Tijuana. And in some respects is a little more fixed in that a number of the Haitians have found jobs, and because there's really has been no opportunity for them to cross at all. So let me, and I see there's some other questions. Let me just go up here. And okay, incentive. Okay, I want to share a little bit about the legal framework of what is going on. So, you know, I've shared about these numbers, right, and a bit of a story, at least, about one family at the La Cubina shelter, and sort of emblematic of the situation there. And when I was at the beginning saying that this is such a roller coaster, it's like whiplash. The legal regime. So what is the law right now at the southern border? So what is contributing to all those statistics and data that I shared with you, immigration court and detention? Since March of 2020, the southern border has been effectively closed to quote unquote non-essential travel, which has in effect really meant has been closed to folks seeking asylum. There is a lot of travel going back and forth, if maybe some of you are engaged in it, at the San Ysidro Port of Entry, which is the busiest land crossing in this hemisphere and arguably number one or number two in the world. Those trucks and buses and traffic that go back and forth, hundreds of thousands of people every week, that has not stopped due to COVID. The border was closed ostensibly, though without CDC support, in March of 2020, and was consistently maintained closed even after this administration took office, despite promises to reopen it. So what that has meant is that folks like you saw portrayed in the video have been, in some respects, piling up, if you will. I hate to use that adjective to describe human beings, but stranded or bottlenecked at various ports of entry all along the southern border, 2,000 miles. Here, Tijuana and Mexicali are major metropolitan areas. So unlike, for example, along the border in Texas, where you may recall in prior years, huge tent cities and encampments arose. Those were largely rural areas across from relatively small towns in Texas. And so the phenomenon was different there. Horribly dangerous in those places, also quite dangerous, frankly, in Tijuana and in Mexicali, but there is a little more infrastructure, at least at the western end of the border, that folks have been able to rely on. Despite requests and lawsuits, the government has decided to keep the border closed. Month after month, advocates and others were hopeful that asylum seekers were going to be allowed to approach the ports of entry and seek asylum, which is something that is guaranteed under international law and pursuant to treaties that the United States originated and signed and has largely in the past honored. But COVID has changed and in some respects provided, frankly, a pretext for keeping the border closed. My editorial opinion there. The back and forth that we've seen the last month has had to do with some litigation that was brought by the states of Texas and Missouri to restart a program that the Biden administration was able to, at least initially, shut down. And that's something called the Remain in Mexico program, sort of, I think, a euphemistically entitled program, also known as the Migrant Protection Protocols. That program, even before COVID, even before the borders were closed, required folks coming from certain countries in Latin America, mostly the ones that we're seeing huge numbers coming from now, to wait and instead of coming to the United States, seeking asylum, perhaps being detained and being able to seek parole and to pursue their immigration case while working, for example, or being reunited with family, they were, again, stranded or, if you want to say, just sort of housed in encampments all along the border. So even before the border closure under the COVID policy, this migrant persecution protocol, some of us like to call it, had the effect of keeping tens of thousands of folks in some of the most dangerous locations, frankly, in this hemisphere. Some of the cities on the Mexican side of the border, all along, particularly in Texas, are murderous places where the very same folks who have been, in many cases, following and persecuting folks in Latin America, in Central America, have followed them right up to the US border. Biden vowed that he would end that program, and he did, but a judge in Texas basically ordered him to restart that program. So as of, the case, of course, is going up through the courts, but sadly, for those of us who are concerned about people wallowing in camps, the tents are now starting to be reconstructed in places like Texas. And the administration, though it's continuing to fight what this judge has ordered, has started to comply with the federal judge's order to resurrect or revive this Remain in Mexico program. So that was sort of a step back, obviously, in many respects. And with respect to the border closure itself, the government had been allowing, after it was sued by the ACLU, a number of exceptions for humanitarian reasons. And one of the things that the folks from St. Margaret's Episcopal and others worked on basically since March of this year were going down, identifying folks who might fall into one of three categories of exception. One was someone with a severe medical condition. The other was a family with small children. And the third was particularly vulnerable populations such as LGBTQ. And so there was a little bit of wiggle room for about 6 months. We had our last family cross actually today. And then negotiations between the government and the ACLU on behalf of immigrants who were trying to assert their rights to seek asylum despite the border closure. Those negotiations fell through, and all of the exceptions ended. So there was really no possibility for people even to claim a humanitarian exception in a large sense. Until a few hours ago. This is what's causing my whiplash today, in that, and this was in the news today, a judge now in that case has ordered, at least with respect to families and children, the government must consider their humanitarian application to come across. So we went from basically a series of 3 types of exception down to nothing, and now the federal judge, in the case where negotiations fell apart, has said, and I haven't even had a chance, frankly, to read the decision because it was just this afternoon that it came out, but basically that families and children, at least, need to be allowed to approach the port of entry and request asylum. So it is a bit of a legal mess. It's hard to follow, and believe me, it is hard to explain to people on a human level at places like La Cobina shelter what the heck is going on. The lawyers can't figure it out, or are trying to follow it. You can imagine how difficult it is to try to explain to someone who's there in a shelter that's squalid and overcrowded what it means, when they're going to be able to cross. Should they try to go around a port of entry? Should they pay another $2,000 if they have it to the smuggler who got them that far to go through the desert? All of these considerations all at the same time. So the border is in flux. The legal regime that applies to the crossings is in flux. There have been some what I'll call good decisions that seem to promised to have returned us to a certain extent to to human rights law and to the guarantees of the Constitution under prior administrations. But we have had some recent court decisions that have really thrown a wrench in the spokes of the administration's desire, I think, and many think, to reopen the border. And of course, the huge numbers that we've talked about have certainly not helped the politics of this. I want to see if there are any questions in the chat about this.
Yeah, we do have a question for you, Troy. And this is, I'm sure, something that several people have questions about and relates to what you and others were working on behalf of the diocese earlier this year. But why are there so many unaccompanied children approaching the border?
I can respond from the perspective of what the law is, well, a little bit about the conditions in the countries of origin, and a little bit about kind of what the law incentivizes people to do. I'll start with the second one first. When Biden took over, he inherited a system of, and I won't go into this too much, the prior administration had actually had a policy of separating families at the border. You might recall this, the family separation policy, where kids were separated from families in the United States, and there's still thousands who've not been reunited with their parents. The Biden administration from the beginning said we are not going to, certainly not going to separate families from children. And when an unaccompanied child presents himself or herself at the border, we're not going to push them back. We're not going to turn them back. That is just, that's sort of a bridge too far. So that has created an incentive for folks to self-separate from their kids. And it's tragic. You've probably seen some of this on the news. I was just watching the nightly news preview a few minutes ago before this presentation. And there was a situation, I think, of a baby in a bassinet and another toddler who were left, I think it was in Texas, by a family, presumably, who had gotten word that unaccompanied children will be taken into the United States. That is, I think, maybe, I don't mean to sound cynical, but that is an incentive that has been created, sadly, by the current situation. But the main driver are the horrific conditions of hyper-violence, really, in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, where kids are subject routinely to recruitment by gangs, extortion, rape, and murder. Kids who are 12, 13, 14 years old. In a couple of weeks, this is a bit of a program note, St. Margaret's Episcopal. If it sounds like I'm pushing a lot of their stuff, it's because I'm really devoted to that church, but I want to share it as an example. We're going to be screening, and it'll be a Zoom, a 2013 film called The Golden Dream, which actually it's a drama. It won an award at Cannes, and it really tells a story of how kids at really young ages kind of become adult in these countries and take to the road themselves because of lack of opportunity and because of incredible violence in their countries of origin. I would say, that's the big main push. And now there's a bit more of an incentive, if you will, which has resulted in some tragic circumstances of self-separation of families at the border.
Thank you, Troy. That's all that we have so far at this moment with other questions. Keep putting them in the chat though, folks.
Please do. And I'm gonna now pivot, as if that's not depressing enough. We only have about 10 minutes left. So I do want to talk about Afghanistan. So I'm gonna do that. And let me move down here. Bear with me one second. Okay. So anyone, I think, who's paid a bit of attention to the news in the last month is aware of the Afghan refugee crisis. And I'll unpack the term refugee in a second. But as of yesterday, basically, we now know that the numbers of where Afghan refugees, or let's call them evacuees, are going to be coming. So this map, which I think everybody can see, shows no big surprise. Some of it has to do with population, and that's why California is getting the most. Texas is getting a big chunk. But these are the numbers of where the evacuees ultimately will be going. As you may know, and some of you may know more than I do about this, a lot of them are still on military bases. And the next step is this distribution throughout the country after a certain amount of processing. What is unique and troubling about the situation as it's developing is that, unlike in other sort of examples of post-war refugee resettlement in the United States, a large number of these folks are going to be admitted to the United States on something called a parole, humanitarian parole, which is not really great. It's not much of anything beyond a temporary permission to be in the country and to seek asylum without a lot of support. So there's a few smaller categories of folks who are going to be resettled actually as refugees, but what a lot of the refugee resettlement agencies who themselves have been decimated in terms of their staff by the gutting of the program in the last 5 years. A lot of the resources that are typically available to refugees are not going to be available to this population because they are coming under a different designation, which is really not providing much in terms of benefits. So this outline here, I'm just giving you the type of, without trying to be too technical, some folks, and a very small minority, are coming under special immigrant visas. And these are for Afghans who worked as interpreters or who were very closely connected to United States military operations in Afghanistan. A second category are, again, a very small category of folks who kind of qualify as the traditional type of refugee, have been admitted to that program overseas, and they're going to be resettled under the auspices of the United States government in the United States. The third category, humanitarian parole, is what I was talking about somewhat dismissively a few seconds ago, and that is a sort of inferior category of temporary permission to be here, which comes with very few, if any, benefits in terms of support from the United States government. Basically, the latest we've heard is that Afghans who are being quote unquote resettled under humanitarian parole are going to be given a status for 2 years. They'll be able to apply for a work permit, and they're going to be given $2,250 or $2,275 in cash assistance. Typically, a refugee who's admitted through the refugee admissions program that you see in the second bullet is supported to the tune of between $5,000 and $7,000 per person. So it really is frustrating, as I'm told by our partners in the refugee resettlement world, that this influx, which is unprecedented, is coming at a time when they are short-staffed due to budget cuts by the prior administration, and that a huge chunk of the people coming in are going to be coming under a type of status that is really sort of a stopgap measure to get the person in the country, and it doesn't come with the type of cash supports or certainly eligibility for things like food stamps. As you can imagine, coming to this country with absolutely nothing, in most cases, you might need a little support. Family reunification and other pathways are minor categories. If, for example, someone already has a relative here, they could perhaps get a visa through a spouse or a sibling or a parent, but those are really long processes that can take in certain cases years and years and years. So the message that we've been getting from our partners in the refugee resettlement world is brace for the long term. We are fortunate as Episcopalians to be part of an amazing network umbrellaed by Episcopal Migration Ministries. In San Diego, we do not have an Episcopal refugee resettlement agency. We do have connections to a number of non-Episcopal ones that we partner with closely. The closest Episcopal refugee resettlement agency is in Los Angeles, but according to federal rules, the refugee client needs to be resettled within a 50-mile drive of the office. So that really doesn't include a lot of, of our diocese. So what we are doing, in fact, I'm on a training tomorrow about next steps for giving folks orientations on the bases before they leave. I think the best way to describe what we're doing locally is trying to rally interest and support and refer folks to some of the resources that the EMM, Episcopal Migration Ministries, has available in terms of recruiting volunteers, because there are going to be needs for housing. There are going to be needs for in-kind support. There are going to be needs for, of course, financial support. At this point, those needs are, I would say, prospective and are just starting to materialize. But it is, again, unprecedented in terms of the numbers of folks that are anticipated in such a short period of time, in terms of the sort of lack of language capability, in terms of the Afghan languages that most of them speak. And so it's going to be a real challenge. I think that the Diocese of San Diego has an opportunity to really think and discern perhaps the role that it might want to play in this crisis. Again, as we don't want to forget about the other and huge phenomenon of Central American migration at the southern border. I want to see. Oh, thanks, Jason, for popping that into the chat. I feel like I'm giving Afghan resettlement very short shrift, but it is in part because it's a moving target. It's an evolving situation. I would say stay tuned to diocesan communications. I'm going to be updating the diocesan newsletter as often as I can. Bishop Snook has sent out an email about 2 weeks ago with resources. At this point, it seems like it's a marshaling of resources. It's a mustering of people who are interested to help. And we will see exactly what that means for the refugees that are settled in our part of California. I would note that the Sacramento area historically has been an area, a location where Afghan nationals have been resettled. So there's a pretty established support network up there. And I and others here are in close contact with our counterparts up in the Bay Area and the Sacramento area who are also kind of bracing for, but with a little bit more infrastructure for the coming of our new Afghan neighbors. All right, we have 3 minutes, and so I guess I'd like it to open it to other questions, either on anything I've said really at this point.
What are the possibilities of September 21st coming and the border opening for shoppers to go back and forth?
Yeah. My assessment is that it's not going to change from August 21st, the 21st being the every month for the last 18 months we've seen it. I think it's what's really been affected are shoppers who are nationals of Mexico. I'm aware of Americans who have gone over to shop and come back. I've not seen that. I assume you're talking about inbound, but yeah, I do not forecast in the next 4 days, any changes, frankly, to the Title 42 border closure policy. Sadly. Other questions or thoughts? I feel like I've really just kind of been the bearer of bad news. It's a moment that we can meet, though, through, I think, and maybe in future talks and through other channels, we can maybe talk a little more concretely in specifics about particular projects. And I'd encourage you to stay tuned again to these diocesan channels for opportunities, service, advocacy, worship, accompaniment. There is certainly no shortage of need. And part of my job is to help focus, I think, us and to help us discern where we might answer Christ's call, how we might do that, how we can marshal the resources that we have. And we have so many in such a rich community as Greater San Diego and all along the border up to Yuma. So I would invite you, by the way, if you're interested in any of this work, there is the Diocesan Task Force on Immigration, Border, and Refugee Issues, which has been meeting bi-weekly. And if you email me, my email address is telder@edsd.org, which I will, if Jason hasn't already, because he's so quick, drop that in. Please send me an email. I would love to just chat with you. We've got a lot of work to do. I think we've got a lot of eager hearts and hands and minds. So I look forward to taking up the mantle of that with you and hearing your ideas. And I also welcome your prayers because, boy, we all need them. So thank you.
Troy, thank you so much. Really grateful for you bringing all of your wisdom and experience and insights into this. And I'm really glad to have you at the helm with this work of the diocese. And thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. We're going to close here in a moment, but before we do, I just want to share with you what to anticipate for our next Transformation Academy. We're going to be hearing from the Reverend Ann Cox Bailey. She is the founder of Ponder Anew, which was created to serve people living with dementia, their loved ones, and care partners. Her work focuses on teaching people how to create compassionate, person-centered relationships that honor everyone involved. And she's especially interested in encouraging churches to become centers of information and assistance in their communities as it relates to this particular part or demographic of our communities. So stay tuned for that. Watch our diocesan channels for information on that. Again, thank you, Troy, for sharing everything with us. As he said, folks, make sure you watch the diocesan channels for more information on what Troy is doing. And I'm going to invite Bishop Susan to close us with a word of prayer. Bishop?
Thank you. And Troy, thank you so much for all you've shared. It's been a great learning experience and an eye-opener to all those who are suffering and also hoping to make new lives in our country. So the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. God, we give you thanks for all we have learned, all we have shared tonight. We give you thanks for Troy and his ministry and his great knowledge about the issues on the border and with migrants coming to our country. We ask you to be with those who are waiting and hoping, give them good living conditions as they wait and hope. Help our justice system to treat people with fairness and respect. We ask you to be with us in our church and our diocese. Help us to know your call for us and how we might be called to serve these all these migrants whom you love, who are created in your image. All this we pray in the name of Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.